Hey Al, here's my next lecture, my next installment. This is lecture 2 of the Gilded Age Progressive Era. We're going to kind of take a little detour. It's still important to American history, and it's something that you might have covered in middle school in the 8th grade. And so this is a continuation of a conversation about the Civil War and Reconstruction and its impact really on American history and American society that's extended for hundreds of years. So in the Civil War, we see the eradication of slavery, and it becomes a constitutional amendment that you cannot allow slavery. And then we see the freedom really of all people supposedly in America in what's called the Reconstruction. So we're kind of diverting. If you remember last time, we were talking about sort of the economic advantages called the Industrial Revolution, which creates this Gilded Age. So it looks gilded in gold, things look great from the outside, but on closer inspection, if you look closely at America in that time, things are not great for poor people, disadvantaged people, people of color. Well, how does that come about? Especially people of color is what we are going to tackle in this lecture, in this episode, and really try to better understand what comes out of the Civil War Reconstruction and leads us into the 1870s, 80s, and 90s, and leads to really, at first, the enfranchisement, sort of in the allowing the vote to happen to Blacks and people of color, to then the disenfranchisement and the sort of the stripping away of the rights that were given from the Civil War and right after the Civil War and Reconstruction. So that's where we're diving in today. Remember to grab your notes, be taking notes, because you will see questions on this later. Okay. All right, but let's get right into it. So what is going to happen in the Civil War and sort of the quest for civil rights after the Civil War? What we call Reconstruction is our topic today. And really, it's a story about minorities and people of color in America. And we know from our other history class in the 8th grade and that history and maybe other things that you've done in your own research or that you've heard is that we have had slavery pretty much maybe since 1619 when we had the first introduction of slaves in Jamestown. And that continues. And it becomes at first an opportunity where African Americans that are imported from Africa are able to achieve their freedom, maybe, but it does become sort of a lifetime institution where people of color, especially Blacks, are imported from Africa. And then there's a series of laws that strips them of any rights, and the only right they have is as property. And it is an institution that we see majority of which in the South. The South is going to be heavily based on this slave population on what's called the plantation system, where slaves are going to be needed for labor, mainly agricultural labor. And so what we have is, as we go through decades in American history, even up into the founding, as we talked about, sort of this issue of slavery is always at the forefront of our American politicians and major decision makers in America. But even our founding fathers sort of had this big decision. Do we keep slavery and continue to exist as even 13 colonies, or should we try to abolish slavery and maybe risk the South seceding even in the American Revolution and afterwards, and forming their own nation where they continue slavery? So it's kind of the can that gets kicked down the curb. It never becomes a problem that's solved until we get to the Civil War. And there's things that precipitate and make the Civil War happen that we don't have time to go into. It's all interesting, and some of it's sad, but leads us to our present day. I feel it's worth mentioning, going back and watching and researching, and any of those things that you enjoy about that. But to see the tremendous victory that also took place when the Union in the North won the Civil War, and what happened in the years following, which gave tremendous hope to everyone in the country, and maybe not if you are in the South or a Southerner, but that is kind of where we're going to continue the story about minorities in America today. And so what exists And the decades following the Civil War is summed up by Bishop B.W. Arnett. I like what he says. He says, "I've traveled in this free country for 20 hours without anything to eat, not because I had no money to pay for it, but because I was colored. Other passengers of a lighter hue had breakfast, dinner, and supper. In traveling, we are thrown in Jim Crow cars, denied the privilege of buying a berth in the sleeping coach. This monster caste stands at the doors of the theaters and skating rinks, locks the doors of the pews in our fashionable churches, closes the mouths of some of the ministers in their pulpits, which prevents the man of color from breaking the bread of life to his fellow men." So how do we get to this point of fighting a war to free the slaves? That's accomplished, and then we have another sort of enslaving process that happens, and that's what we're getting to today. So out of the Civil War, it's important to remember that war ended in 1865 after 4 years of fighting. It begins in 1861 with South Carolina seceding. And in total, about 618,222 men in uniform are killed. That number continues to rise as historians continue the research and in family histories and lineage and battlefield, exhuming battlefield casualties, things along those lines. And they estimate about 130,000 civilians, including about 50,000 slaves, and that number perished. The number could be higher. There's some historians that believe it's 1 million Americans are going to die in the Civil War, both in uniform and as civilians. So tremendously devastating, costly war in all terms: economic, political, cultural, societal, just a complete tearing apart of our country. And then as it's torn apart, how do we put it back together? That becomes the big thing that we call Reconstruction. So it becomes a war of secession, right? We have the South secede, and that's the South or the Confederates. And why they do so is to continue the institution of slavery and to fight for states' rights is another thing that you might hear, and power against the federal government. But it turned into all-out war where the North, led by Abraham Lincoln, who just got elected, wanted to reunify the country and squash slavery at the same time. So it turned into a war of freedom for all people in America. And then after the war is won by the North, the Northern troops, the Union soldiers, are going to remain in the South. And it's this period of time that is called Reconstruction. Whereas the Northern troops remain in the South, they are there guarding and protecting freed slaves. They're guarding the Republicans that might be politicians or Republican businessmen or other Northern businessmen that come from the South to do business in the South and try to sort of rebuild and start over in the South. Which they're called carpetbaggers. They're not well regarded by the South in history and looked at very poorly. But throughout this time, basically from 1865 to 1877, that we call Reconstruction, there's Northern troops in the South, kind of like an occupying force to protect individual citizens, especially the freed Blacks that are free of the bondage of slavery at this point. So, but while the Southern Democrats, who have always opposed enfranchisement, sort of voting for minorities, and who oppose civil rights, equal rights for people of color in this country, while the Democrats are out because they had seceded, the Confederates in the South. So there's a Republican majority, and Republicans at this point were led by Abraham Lincoln and get elected in all the northern states. So Congress in Washington, D.C. is dominated by Republicans at this time. There's still several Democrats from what are called the border states between the North and the South, like Maryland is a good example. And what else am I trying to think of? Virginia, no, not Virginia, they're in the South. Anyways, I'm forgetting my border states. Come on, Messner. But while the Democrats and the Southern states are out of the Union, the North ends up passing some pretty significant amendments to the Constitution. And the first happened during the Civil War while it's still going on. And that's the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, was passed in 1865, the last year of the war. There's a great movie and a great book called Team of Rivals about Abraham Lincoln. And then there's a movie just called Lincoln about sort of that fight to pass the 13th Amendment. And unfortunately, as the war concludes, 1865, Lincoln is assassinated. But as one of the things to sort of enshrine his legacy, in 1866, again, the Republicans are in Congress, that we haven't allowed back the Southerners, mainly the Democrats, back into Congress yet because they haven't technically rejoined the Union, because they have to basically disavow like Confederates and the stuff that they were fighting for, which they're not wanting to do. And um, but the 14th Amendment gets passed 1866, and it says that all persons born in the United States become American citizens. So maybe you enjoy that benefit. I do. I was born here in America, so that automatically makes me an American citizen. And it also says that no state can deny people here in America of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, meaning you have to be charged of a crime, tried, and found guilty of a crime before they can take your life, liberty, or property from you, which we find that is not protected pretty shortly here after the Civil War. And then the 15th Amendment also cannot deny voting to anyone on the basis of race. So at this moment in 1869, when the 15th Amendment passes, even in the South, even though they haven't necessarily rejoined the Union at this point, they are sending still senators and representatives, although we now have the vote of African-American men. It's not women yet. Technically in 1920, when women are given the right to vote via the 19th Amendment, technically Black women could vote, but they're not going to be able to vote in most states because of racism, especially in the South, not allowed. But the 15th Amendment does allow Blacks to vote basically from 1869 to the mid 1870s. But also what exists while Reconstruction is happening is an interesting social experiment in which now people that were born into slavery, grew up in slavery, are now free, are adjusting to this life of freedoms. And one thing our government does, which is an initial success, is start what's called the Freedmen's Bureau. So men, women that are former slaves are supposed to receive benefits from the government, help from the government, and this new life of freedom established in 1865 at the end of the Civil War. And what they do is they help former slaves, and they also don't just help Blacks, but also poor whites in the South who have been ravaged by the Civil War, give them food and housing, medical aid, and they build hundreds of hospitals. They give legal aid. Many times slaves weren't recognized in their marriages. It was just a verbal kind of commitment, and no court of law was going to say, yeah, you're right, you do have a marriage certificate. But now that the Civil War is over and these rights are bestowed on former slaves, they are able under law to be married and enjoy marriage certificates and that benefit as well. And then the most important thing is that slaves are educated, former slaves are educated. So for the first time, Blacks are being taught to read and write in the South. And hundreds, thousands of people are being educated, and there's thousands of schools that are being built. And many times it was whites, many times white women were leaving the North to go to the South to be teaching former slaves, whether it could be children, it could be also adults, how to read and write, and other civic lessons about how to participate in our American society and history, which is a really cool story. But unfortunately, the Freedmen's Bureau, teachers that were teaching in the schools, doctors, anyone really serving people of color in the South became early targets for this new organization that starts to rise after the Civil War called the Ku Klux Klan. And you've probably heard of them before. A former Confederate general, Nathan Bedford Forrest, organizes the original KKK. And so their goal becomes to continue the segregation of the races. And so what they do is just rule through intimidation and then violence. Okay, so if you were a white person that was down in the South doing business or trying to teach to former slaves how to read and write, you could be a target. And also African Americans would be a target too. So if you were going to school, if you were trying to vote, if you were an elected representative, you could be a target. And so there's becomes this great fear and intimidation, and led by the KKK. So eventually Congress ends up caving to white Southerners to scrap the Freedmen's Bureau because it's a lot of money. It's a lot of resources to send food, housing, medical aid. And eventually there's some other forces happening that I don't have time to get into in the mid 1870s that eventually stops the Freedmen's Bureau and ultimately sort of squashes it. But it did have a tremendous success and tremendous advantage in helping to educate and take care of freed slaves. acclimate them to life in America as free people. But probably the biggest thing to highlight is what's called Black enfranchisement, in which Blacks, or Black men specifically, are allowed to vote through the 15th Amendment. So, Black men are able to vote for the first time nationwide in nationwide elections in 1869 with the passage of the 15th Amendment. And so what's cool is that 15% of all elected office holders in the South, whether it's local elections, state elections, national elections, were filled by African Americans, by former slaves. And it's probably important to say that they were all Republicans too. If you remember, Abraham Lincoln was a Republican. And then once he got elected, because his campaign strategy was, I want to stop the expansion of slavery, especially into the West. Once he got elected, the South seceded. And so the Republican Party became the party of free Blacks because it was given to them by the North, by these Republicans in Congress in the North. And so every Black congressman that was elected was a Republican. And the Democratic Party became the party in the South at that time of trying to restrict those rights or segregate Blacks again and strip them of those rights. And so of all those elected in the South, the top sort of post, there was 2 African Americans that were elected U.S. senators. This one on the lower right, his name is Hiram Revels. He's our nation's first African American ever to be elected to national office. He's a senator from Mississippi. And then he's pictured in this picture with other representatives who formed really the first Black caucus, the first group of African Americans to serve in our national government. There's 2 senators, and then a total of 15 U.S. representatives get elected from southern states to represent their constituents and represent their states in our national government in Congress, which is a pretty cool story. Now, their life as far as serving in politics is pretty short-lived because of the rise of the KKK and then the rise of the Democratic Party to continue to disenfranchise Blacks in the South. And so voting is slowly going to erode in the late 1870s through new what are called Black codes, which is basically it starts the early segregation process. If you're a Black, you can't own property. If you're a Black, you can't be out past a certain time in this town. If you're Black, you can only live in certain sections of town. And so these Black codes, even though African Americans are supposed to be free and equal at this time through the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment, we start to see southern states passing these local laws, these state laws, to take these newfound rights away from Blacks really again. So they're not thrown back into slavery. There's still freedoms, but there's very sort of regimented, regulated life. And these Black codes eventually become what we call the Jim Crow laws. And we'll talk more about those when we get to the civil rights movement. We also see the rise of the KKK, which I mentioned, and they start terrorizing and killing Blacks. It's this large movement of lynching Blacks just because they're Black or maybe tried to vote or because they were talking to certain people. So really it becomes a very sort of intimidation-laden organization. And it's not just the KKK. We see the rise of different leagues of paramilitary groups. I'm trying to remember their names right now. I can't. So every state kind of has their own local white militia, not just the KKK that becomes sort of the big one and throughout all the South, but other states have their own kind of. White League is from Louisiana. And so they it's kind of each state has their own kind of white militia, which goes about. And you might be saying, where's the federal government? Where are those soldiers that are in the South? And they are actively resisting these groups. And even President Grant, our former general who led us to victory with the Union Army in the Civil War, he gets elected president and he serves one term and he basically squashes and stamps out the KKK with the soldiers, the Union soldiers that are in the South. He basically goes and he terrorizes them and squashes them. But what continues to rise, he ends up not running for re-election, and the next guy that gets elected basically is like, okay, well, we've done too much. We're spending too much money. We got nationwide issues to focus on. We're getting tired of dealing with Southern stuff, and kind of lets these white paramilitary groups run rampant. And so no one is really protecting Blacks in the South, unfortunately. And we also see Democrats kind of regain power in the South, both because the Republicans have corruption issues nationwide. And then just as Blacks are kind of receding in public life out of fear and intimidation from these military groups, then sort of the Democrats and whites continue to swoop in and regain power in politics and through voting. So how does the Reconstruction end in this time period? Well, we've talked about the rise of the Southern Democrats are coming back. We see the rise of the KKK and other paramilitary groups causing violence on Republicans and Blacks in the South, both white and Black. We see the rise of these Black codes, and then the corruption of the National Republican Party under Ulysses S. Grant as president sort of really divides the nation and the North and the West again. And so what ends up happening is two guys run for president in 1876. One is a Democrat who has major support from the South, okay, and from some Western states and some of those middle border states. And then we have a Republican candidate, Rutherford B. Hayes, who has the majority of all the Republicans in the North and some in the West. But what the Republicans don't have that they usually banked on was a lot of voters in the South that were African Americans, that were Blacks, that were participating. But as fewer and fewer Blacks are voting, then sort of the power that the Republican Party had in the South recedes. And so then the power of the Democratic Party grows. And so what we have is basically a tie in the election of 1860 or 1876, in which Hayes and Tilden, the Democrat is Tilden, the Republican is Hayes, basically tie. And so as these Southern states are sending in their results, we are figuring out in Congress that there is a tie. And it's like, oh my gosh, what is it going to do? And so the Constitution says that there's a vote in the Senate and a vote in the House. The vote in the Senate decides the presidency. The vote in the House decides the vice president. And so they go to voting in the Senate. It's really interesting history and kind of sad at that too. But sort of those that were siding with Tilden in the Senate and voting for Tilden said, hey, we will let Rutherford B. Hayes win the election of 1876 if you pull the federal troops out of the South and in Reconstruction. And so in 1877, that is what Congress agreed with, is that, okay, we'll let the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes win, and we'll pull federal troops out of the South, which did end up happening. So with that, with the troops leaving the South, basically all hope for African Americans to be protected and be able to exercise their rights and freedom also kind of left with those troops, unfortunately. And after that moment, we see the South becoming resegregated again, in which, you know, we're going to have white society and sort of the white privileges, and then we're going to have Black and African American society, people of color, be regulated to a second-class status, kind of like they had before the Civil War, right? So they're not technically slaves, but they're still sort of living at the mercies of whites that are in power in the South. So the South becomes resegregated. Blacks and minorities become disenfranchised again, where it becomes illegal to vote. And you're really pretty much risking your life, even though federally you're able to vote. Many states are going to say it's illegal to vote, or you have to pass a literacy test, or your grandfather should have been eligible to vote, and then you can. And so we're going to see all these restrictions placed on people of color, and only people of color, if they want to vote. And at that, they might be killed, maybe by the KKK or some of these other paramilitary groups. So the KKK gets stamped out in the mid 1870s by President Grant, but they're going to rise again in the 1890s, early 1900s, and kind of have a second resurgence through the 1920s. And then again, a third resurgence through the 1950s, 1960s of the civil rights movement. And they're pretty much like not much around. They claim just hundreds of members now that are associated with the KKK. There's not a nationwide, huge, large gathering or grouping of the KKK ever. They show up and do marches of 40 people in Illinois. They like to go to this one town in Illinois, but really they don't have a nationwide presence because everyone really hates them across the country. Republicans and Democrats hate the KKK and the awful history that they have. But we also start to see in the South that the federal government really is tired of stepping in and helping African Americans and people of color in the South. And so they don't sort of send help. They don't guarantee these rights. And even in the Congress, even in In the Supreme Court, there's court cases that come, Congress passes laws, but then they never get enforced. But the most famous court case happens in 1896, Plessy versus Ferguson, in which a man sits on a trolley car in New Orleans, and he looks white, but people know that he has African-American blood in him. And so they force him to sit in the segregated colored section of the trolley car. And he ends up suing the city for that. It gets appealed from there all the way up to the Supreme Court. And even though the gentleman looks white, Plessy looks white, because the law in Louisiana said that if you have any drop of African-American blood, you are technically colored, then you have to sit in the colored section. The Supreme Court ruled, well, there is a white trolley car and a colored trolley car. They're pretty much equal. So they passed this court case that said, well, you can have separate facilities like trolley cars or movie theaters or schools as long as they're both equal. And so this enshrines this idea of segregation as long as both are equal. But what we're going to see throughout decades more of American history is that there is no equality in that system. And that's going to be thrown on its head in 1954 with the passage of Brown versus Board Education, which overthrows this idea of separate but equal, because they're going to prove that equality is not happening in a system of segregation. And so segregation is done away with, but again, is going to take decades to really implement and truly afford equal rights for all people, regardless of race in this country. But I'm going to stop here on this lecture. I feel like it was important to mention this. There might be a lot of questions. Hopefully you wrote those down. You're thinking about it. You can do your own research. You're always welcome to email me and talk more with me about it. It's a very interesting and at times sad part of American history, but also very important. It's important to know this stuff because it can remind us of what it's taken, sort of the sacrifices of many to bring us to this point where everyone has equality and equal opportunity in this country. And so, but I would love to engage in other conversations with you if you have those. But thanks for taking notes, and you can look for another lecture next class. All right, thanks.